graduating next summer? Maybe.
Thank you. Justine?
Hi, I'm Justine. I am a political science and history major, and I'm graduating in spring 2021.
Somehow. Okay, Aiden, go ahead.
I'm a history major. I'm hoping to graduate this fall, 2020.
Thank you. Don?
I'm Don. I'm a history secondary ed major, and I'm hoping to graduate by spring of 22.
And I see you recently changed your desk or computer around.
We missed the milk mustache.
No, he's had the Denver Nugget player with the milk advertising.
Oh, nice.
Mustache, so he's, I hope you didn't think I was giving him a bad time too much through the semester, I think. Derek.
I'm Derek. I'm a history secondary education major, and I graduate in spring 2021.
Who had left? Morgan?
Yes, I'm Morgan. I'm a history major. I should be graduating in fall of 2023.
Okay, is anybody else I missed? Okay.
Yeah, I can go.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry. Trevor.
I'm Trevor. I'm a history and secondary education major, and I plan on graduating next spring.
So his background, this is pretty much the same I've been seeing for the last 10 and a half weeks, is the corner of his room with the curtains, the sunlight, morning sunlight coming out from above his curtains. So I was up in my room here, the separate room up on the second floor. I turned the bedroom into an office for the whole but I moved down here about, a month ago, because it's nice and cool. All right, Melissa, sorry. If you could go ahead and, go with yourself, and then we'll, as best you, however you like, the floor is now yours. Of course, we're talking about then eventually those Mexican Americans that lost their lives in 2006.
Well, thank you guys so much. I'm really happy to be here. Quickly, I apologize in advance if you see children or husbands running in and out. They were at the park, now they're back apparently, so that happens. The joys of everyone working from home, right? Yeah. So how many of you guys, raise your hand, how many of you guys grew up in Southern Colorado? Or, have been here for a while? Okay. So I grew up in Pueblo County. I went to Pueblo County High School. All the work that Michael's doing is super interesting to me because I have farming and ranching in my background. I'm a 7th generation Coloradoan on my dad's side and 5th on my mom's. So, and my grandparents were all ranchers and farmers in Pueblo County. So I think this is super interesting. And I remember driving out to Lamar and then just stopping on the way home to see my family because it was Easter weekend afterward and not going home for the weekend. So anyway, so that's a little bit about myself. I went to the University of Colorado, got my journalism major. I worked in Milwaukee and then moved to Denver, worked in Denver for a couple years. And then shortly after, this was probably one of the last major stories I did in Colorado because I moved to Massachusetts that summer. So I tried to do some research before the class to see if I could fill in any pieces about what happened after from a legal standpoint. And because I wasn't here to sort of find that out myself and cover that story. But so I'll sort of just walk you through what I knew and how I found out about it. And then if you guys have questions, feel free to just chime in at any point and then we can sort of talk about it after. Some of my memories are murky and I've already sort of things that I thought I remembered don't exactly match what I wrote or what other people wrote. So again, that's the history part about it, right? Is no one quite knows what, now looking back on it. I was telling Michael the other interesting thing about it was this is sort of a really interesting time because it was right on the cusp of journalism changing dramatically. So when I went in 2006, I had 2 cell phones, a work cell phone and a personal cell phone. Neither of them worked. So no cameras, phones, no way to upload videos or photos. There were no photos of the people I interviewed, of the places I went, because I didn't have a photographer with me. If this thing happened today, I would have videos, photos, you know, I would have maybe even like live streamed stuff to my editors so that they could talk to people, ask questions. I remember having to go to the Lamar newspaper and ask them very nicely if I could work at one of their computers, because obviously no Wi-Fi, no hotspots, nothing of that nature. So the way it happened was we heard about the story and I basically got in my car and drove 4 hours. That first day that it happened, I drove immediately out to the site, and obviously most of it was already cleaned up. The car was still there. The train was gone, I believe, at that point, and there were still police officers cleaning up the scene. And that's when, if you guys read my story, Eric Jensen, who is a large farm owner down there, he was still on the scene, and I remember talking to him briefly, and he was the one that originally sort of told us. He was one of the first people on the scene and sort of saw what had happened and tried to help the people who were still alive. If you guys remember, there were 7 people total in that car, and 6 of them were killed. There was a mom who had 3 children, and then there were other people, and they were all from, you know, southern Texas, and they were all U.S. citizens. This was not a case of workers from Mexico, either undocumented or documented. They were all citizens coming up to work. And from what I can gather, they were not, what I remember is this was not typical for them. There were definitely people, and there definitely still are people who kind of do a circuit, right? Who start in Texas and plant and then go further north and then harvest, right? And these were not typical. Because one of the things that everyone told me first off was they only worked for a couple days. They were planting onions, and it was hard. They were getting paid piecemeal, which if you're good at doing that type of work, I remember I think my story says they could make up to $15 an hour. And again, this was 14 years ago. They were not making minimum wage trying to plant these onions because it was difficult and they were not experienced doing so. And so that was one of the reasons why they thought they had chose to leave, was they were going to go to Denver where they knew other people and sort of re-examine what they were going to do next. And then this is the part where I have conflicting information and I unfortunately don't know. Some of the story says they were traveling north as if they were going to Denver, right? Mm-hmm. Some of the stories said they were traveling back south. And the brother of one of the people, the brother that I interviewed of one of the women who was killed, said he thought they were traveling south because he thought she had changed her mind and she wanted to come home. He had advised her not to go and he thought she might be coming home. Other people said maybe they were coming back because they had forgotten something. It was not that far from the farm that they were in. They had stopped in Lamar and purchased a bunch of food and other things for the trip. And so, you know, but again, I don't know, it might've been hard to tell based on where the car was after the accident, if they were traveling north or south, or that information may have changed. So after I was at the crash site and learned a little bit about the scene, I went and I talked to Mr. Jensen. he recommended to me to go to the migrant housing. And the migrant housing was on his property, and it was something that he would provide for the people who were working there. But at this point, it was fairly dark and I was alone. And so I said, okay, I'm just going to go in the morning. And I drove back to Lamar and had to get on the payphone. Again, this is how things are very different now. I had to stand in line at the Walmart to get on a payphone and call my bosses and tell them what I knew and say I was going to get back on it in the next day. The next day, I went first, and let me look at my notes here to I went first to Ramon Solis, who was at that time, he was sort of like, I would say, the migrant manager. He lived full-time on the property. He had a home. He had, I sat in his living room and talked to his family. And he told me a little bit just about how things worked there, how people got paid, how people came and went. He is also, if you read my stories, he's the one that went around collecting for the family, which I remember being personally touched by, because these people had only been there for a couple days, really. But the idea that most of these people had a very similar situations, right? They traveled a lot. They didn't stay in one place. And so I think they sympathized with him. And then after that, I drove out to the housing, which a couple of things struck me. These were, not great conditions, very small kind of rows of houses, not houses, but sort of row, almost like a motel, you know what I mean? Entrance, kitchen, a bed, a table. And that's where I met Joey, who was the brother of Melissa. And he was actually, here's another thing that was really touched me personally, was he was actually working. So when I came in, his girlfriend was there with their baby and her mom, and he was out working the day after his sister had been killed. So that gives you a little bit of knowledge of what financially, you know what I mean? There was
Right.
what they were going through, and what was sort of required of this work. So, and he was the one that we talked a little bit. He told me about how she wanted to pay for a car. And so she sort of thought, oh, I'll just go and try this to see if I could earn money for my car. And then he had gone, he had followed with his girlfriend and her mom, I remember. And if you remember, if you read the story, both him and his sister had were hearing impaired. And one of the things they thought that could be a cause of the crash was they had the music turned up really loudly. And they thought maybe, because there was no fencing or gate or, barrier. And so they thought maybe they didn't hear the train because the music was very loud. And it could have been because at least one, and I have conflicting reports about this, but I know Melissa was definitely hearing impaired. So maybe they had the music loud just because they couldn't hear. So after I talked to him and some other people at the site, what then really struck me was these conditions, these workers, and they were so close to the Yamachi internment camp. And just the parallels of farm work, what farm work looked like then and what the Japanese internment camp looked like at that time, earlier. And so at that point, I went to Granada and I talked to a couple of people and just tried to make some parallels between that. And what struck me, so I grew up, as I said, I grew up in Southern Colorado, and I definitely saw, I grew up with massive farms all around me, and I definitely saw prejudice and racial discrimination of migrant farm workers, of Mexican American families who had been, my grandpa, who I said was at that point 5th generation Colorado, the discrimination he faced as a Mexican American. And so what struck me in Granada was that everyone I talked to, I did not see that. in the people that I talked to in Granada and Lamar. There was no, well, this is what happens when people come over, or, anything like that. It was it seemed like everyone understood the relationship that migrant farm workers had with the community. It seemed like, and maybe they talked a lot about the people who came every year, twice a year for harvest and planting, and how they would get to know the community. Their kids would be in school. So that, I remember being struck by the community just really embracing this area of this other community, and really just, now granted, these was the 7 people I talked to or whatever. So, I'm sure that discrimination and racial prejudice exists in that area, but not to anyone that I spoke to. And then I'm trying to think, yeah, so that's basically, the 16-year-old Christopher Cruz who was driving, it did not appear that he was licensed or legally even permitted to drive. And he was the only survivor. They flew him up to Denver, and the research I found said that the State Patrol did recommend charges against him, but I never found whether he was officially charged, whether he was tried. Some of that might be because he was a minor, and those records typically are either expunged or closed to reporters. The other thing was, I did read that his family was trying to return him to Texas quite quickly, and the charges were the recommendations of charges came several months later. And so the district attorney honestly may have said, look, this kid, what he went through, and the idea of trying to get him from Texas to face any charges as a minor might have just been too much. So that's the one piece. There are several pieces I don't know, but that's the major one, is I have no idea what happened legally after that. So yeah, am I missing anything? Does anyone have questions or want to chat? Or
So where was the accident? I haven't really seen like what the crossroads was on the.
So it was north of Lamar. Let me see if I could remember exactly how. Let me look at my notes and see if I can remember it exactly. So they were about. It was sort of between Lamar and Granada north, about a half mile, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And they had gone. So, if Granada is, Michael, is it like half an hour, 20 minutes?
You're muted.
You're muted, sorry.
No wonder nobody heard. About 22 miles from Lamar to the east on Highway 50, yeah.
Okay, so I remember the housing was sort of between Lamar and Granada. Mm-hmm. And then the accident was, so they had driven to Lamar to the Walmart, and then they had and then they were about a half mile north of the farm, heading toward Denver when this happened. The other thing that I remember that I just was so, one of the starkest things I will remember is, I told you I went to the Walmart to get on the payphone. Mm-hmm. And I stood in line, and then as I was talking, other people behind me were in line, and it was actually the family of Melissa Resendez, because there were no phones in the migrant camps either. So they were actually we didn't know, because I didn't know them and they didn't know me at that point, but we were all in line together to talk about this crash from the payphones at the Walmart.
Oh, so it's a family of Melissa?
Yeah. It was Joey's girlfriend who was in line. Cynthia Gayton was in line behind me, waiting for me to finish talking to my boss so that she could continue to call family and relatives and talk to them.
Anybody else? You recall what they were saying, or you didn't have a chance to hear them speak on the phone?
I didn't. And to be perfectly honest, I would have waited and been like, excuse me, and obviously tried to interview them that night, but I did not hear them, or else I would have, it would have been. And I remember telling my boss, like, how am I going to find these people at 7 o'clock at night? And they were
right behind you.
The other thing I just remembered that I wanted to kind of touch on was the sort of the interesting correlation I found between Amachi and the migrant farm. And Michael, I'm sure you guys have talked about this, like why Amachi was placed there. I think obviously Colorado, the governor at the time, was sort of very friendly towards this idea. That's not great, but then also just the agricultural bit of it. And the research that I've done on Amachi was that they had a very successful agricultural process and were quite successful in what they were doing. And Michael, you may know this more, even were sort of hired out to help the local farmers, right?
It's in the immediate area I believe so, but the area around main built up area of Amache was commandeered from the federal government, and Japanese Americans were just solely responsible for that particular area. And in fact, the area that the accident was in, it was part of that. A little bit more in the detail, but I wanted you to finish what you recollected, and that way I don't stop on that. But yeah, no, there was work passes that they would go out to other farms and then do that. I don't know if they would come back or stay with them for a short bit, but yeah, there's a mixture of both. There might have been like 2 seasons. They got there in October 1942, so really the summer of 43 and 44 and maybe 45. By 45, even early 45, they already went in the process of starting to close down, but this very gradual of them leaving, going back. So just leased them 2 summers, but they were rather successful, and they had, produce, vegetable festivals there on Amache. I remember we have a interview that I put on class for the show, Martina Pena. She's 88 years old, and she still lives there. She remembers going to Amache as a kid, seeing this festival that they probably had somewhere in the recreation hall or something like that. Or yeah. So yeah, they did. It may have impacted to this day the soil to some extent. Probably kind of hard to tell with all the different kind of stuff they put in there, fertilizer and pesticides. I don't know for sure, but yeah.
It just really struck me the different systems that pocket of Colorado has put in place to get cheap labor to fulfill their agricultural needs and our agricultural needs, right? Like,
do you remember talking to, or are those who you talked to as far as the Granada residents? You mentioned like 7 of them. Do you remember?
So, yeah, the one I really remember, I went to a barber shop in Granada. Granada also, we're not talking a big city, guys. It was sort of dead. So I was just like happy to find anyone. And the one I remember talking to was Manuel Gonzalez, who was a local football coach. And so he had an interesting perspective, because he knew a lot of people would bring their families and they would enroll for maybe the fall or the first quarter of the fall and then move on, right? And then maybe come back for the last quarter of the spring. So yeah, I remember speaking to him directly, and he, like I said, had a very sympathetic view of the lives that migrant workers were living, of constantly moving and having to sort of go where the money was, and the frankly hard labor. When you're working piecemeal, you can't take a day off, you can't slow down.
What Now, had these, had they, I don't know if it was you or the Denver Post or reported on whether or not they had done planting onions before or not.
So I do remember talking, especially with Jensen. He had said that they had told him that they were experienced in planting onions, but he said it became very apparent that that was not the case. And so it sounded like this was a new thing for most of them, and that frankly they just weren't making enough money to make it worthwhile.
But I would imagine that Joey was kind of experienced in doing that, apparently.
Yeah, or or maybe he just decided, he needed to figure out. I'm looking back at my story and it says he plans to stay in Granada a little longer to earn some more money, find out what investigators learn about the accident, and place a small memorial at the place where his sister died. So I don't know if he just didn't have enough money to get home and so needed to at least make enough to get home.
Said you had a girlfriend and a daughter, or when you?
And again, my memory is a little fuzzy, but I remember a baby, and so I thought it was his baby, but it might have been her mom's baby, because the girlfriend's mother, the girlfriend Joey, and the small baby. But I feel like it was her. So he had again, it's a little fuzzy, and I couldn't find my actual notes, but I feel like it was he had a family at that point.
You talked to Ramon Solis at the housing or in Lamar?
So his housing, I talked to him in his home, and it was separate from the migrant housing, but in the same area. Because like I said, he was sort of like the manager, and he had, his home was his home. His wife was there, his family was there. It was not a temporary, I think he was a year-round employee.
Did he say who he was working for, the Eric Jensen?
I believe he was working for the Jensens, yeah.
Yeah. Did you see anybody other than Eric Jensen brothers or Jensen family? Or just
I
Eric?
didn't, and I told you I saw him at the scene, but now that was incorrect. I actually went to his home.
You went to, oh wow.
I went to Eric Jensen's home, and his wife was there, and they invited me in. They were, and Michael, tell me if I'm wrong here, but this is the Jensens who had the massive cantaloupe issues, right?
Yeah, this is, in 2011, the listeria outbreak, when the processing, washing and boxing up the cantaloupe, 2011, the processing warehouse got contaminated with standing water or something. Did kill a few dozen, a couple of them, like 30, and hundreds were injured at least. And they're already still within some legal trouble, and they've already had some trouble legally with them actually in Holly, in the hotel there. And as far as conditions, they were actually they go through some other person, but they own a hotel there, and they had some, I think this would have been 2012 or so, that there were migrant workers living there, but the windows were boarded up. There were actually no bed springs or beds, so they got fined for that. And now they're still being charged for transporting controlled substance by Seward County, Kansas prosecuting attorney. It's been a little bit over a year now, so they're just using the still rather draconian laws on cannabis, marijuana in Kansas to keep them hemmed up. I've talked to them and the prosecuting attorney. They're trying to put in extraditing them and all that. And they're still under charges. I think it is Eric or the younger guy, their son. I'm not sure.
So they have switched to cannabis too then, huh?
They have extensively, and I think
Wow.
the student class here they now have to register with the Colorado State Department of Agriculture for growing hemp, and they are on there. They use a different name other than Jensen, but they are on there. I kind of cross-reference with them, and yes, the question, I believe they do have migrant or seasonal workers, and they are living there at the housing right now. Because I went down there a couple days ago and snooped around, and there were a little bit more people there living than I usually see. The buildings are usually empty had people in them. But as far as whether or not there's some, what do you call it, accountability or reporting, as far as the U.S. Department of Labor, they're required through the Migrant and Seasonal Farm Workers Protection Act 2012 or so. The contract worker has to be registered along with the worker employee. So that means that, yeah, there should be a correlation between, I believe, if you have, so I know there's workers for hemp, but the registration for them growing hemp and with the contract worker registration, Department of Labor on the federal side, you cannot discern or configure, there's nothing there you can see to tell has migrant workers. And in 2006, well, yeah, they should have been in 2006. That's one of the big questions. And it's always been, as my class has seen historically since sugar beet industry, that migrant housing conditions for those who lived on the farmer's land was rather poor and very, very, just disregarded our conditions overright. Well, that's what I talk about as human rights and looking at it that way. And I think we see a little bit of a problem or some big holes that there isn't any, I've been told it's word of mouth for those who come up from either from Mexico or the Texas borderlands. The deacon at the Catholic Church in Lamar told me that they try to do a very good job of getting word of mouth. I interviewed the state monitor advocate up in Denver, Olga Ruiz, and she's told me that they're required to check the housing, and but when they come up and they don't necessarily, especially with hemp, looks like they don't always report because most of them are immigrants, H2A now, and that's how most of them are getting the labor, I believe, H2A, and a lot of stigma as far as their status legally kind of puts a constraint upon them wanting to be registered. So yeah, you can't see it. There's no transparency. Unfortunately, I think that's what happened in 2006. Because yes, they're probably more likely left to go find a job. It's I don't know if you had anything. I didn't want it. I'm sure the students may have a couple student questions, if they just kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that brings up a really good point, which is there was no safety net for these people, especially if they were new workers who had it did not sound like they'd ever traveled to this area before. They had never done this type of work. There was no, if what they were saying was true and that, yeah, it didn't work out for them, they may have not had money to get back to Texas, or they may have not had any way. There were 7 people in this Ford Explorer. So there was not a way for them to travel safely to Denver.
Yeah.
It brings up the question of why the unlicensed teenager was driving. Were they exhausted? Was someone hurt or sick? we just don't know. But I think you're right, Michael. There was nobody that they could turn to get assistance.
I think that,
Problems that they were
I'm
facing.
sorry, I should have. Where was Joey at the time of the accident? I think that might be somewhat.
So if I remember correctly, he was working because it was earlier in the morning, right?
Yeah.
On a Thursday. And so if I remember correctly, he was working. And if I remember correctly, I remember the girlfriend saying that it wasn't until he came home that day from the fields that he found out about what had happened.
Oh, I thought yeah, when you say there was conflicting stories there, or what was reported with, and then with the, so a lot of this went out on, so it did go nationwide. Your press release, Associated Press release, got out tells I think it's important that technology, or at the time, as far as printed media at the time, Associated Press, I think a little bit that might help us, because it got out, and that's how traditionally is the Associated Press worked, as far as the newspaper. So tell us about that a little bit.
Sure. So the Associated Press has always been a nonprofit wire, because originally the news went out over wires. But how it works is that the Associated Press has employees, and they're paid by other news organizations. So at the time, like the Lamar paper was a member of the Associated Press. The Denver Post is a member. And so I would write a story, put it on our news wire, we called it. And then at that point, it would go through the internet. And any of our members across the country and the world could then put it in their own newspapers or on their own sites. So that was how it became national. Was my story went out nationally, and then the newspapers and radio stations and TV stations could pick that up and use it for their own use.
Do you know if any of the networks or local news channels picked up on that, or some? I don't remember.
I don't.
No, I haven't seen that either.
Yeah.
But I heard Joey heard the accident. He was just out there on either Grasmick or Jisson's field.
Oh, and he heard it. Oh, I did not hear that or remember that.
Yeah, that might have been the Denver, or I don't know if it was a Springs Gazette or the Denver Post, or I don't even know. Okay, the Rocky Mountain News. Rocky Mountain News, I guess, like.
Oh yeah, the Denver Post does say that. No, and again, this could be what I remember and what other people. I could be.
So a lot of this is also in the Rocky Mountain News. Also did their kind of their stuff, and Rocky Mountain News has its own colored history, quite a bit actually in Denver. They just recently went bankrupt. But they're a very historic newspaper, good and bad, as far as overall being not, it can't be, left and right politically. I guess when the Chinese were in Denver and they wanted the Chinese out, so they were on that side pushing out the Chinese, but they were the ones, kind of the source that started the riot there in Denver in 1882. So it was really the Rocky Mountain News side, and on the Democrat side, I can't remember, it was Garfield or I can't remember which one it was. So they have a colored history, but the Rocky Mountain News had a little bit of stuff. Maybe they're the ones that, I don't know if I shared that on for the students or not. Does anybody have any recollection on as far as the articles there, Melissa's, or? Okay. I guess what else would I ask? When you say as your background, as far as you growing up in the area, and your who is your grandfather? What's your grandfather's name? You said, as far as in the area?
So my grandpa was named Gilbert Trujillo, and he was actually a president of the steel mill in Pueblo in the 80s and early 90s. But as I said, I grew up, I don't know how many, like the Pueblo natives will know, I grew up on 38th Lane. So I grew up in Vineland on farmland. And an interesting aside is that within the last 2 years, my grandma, who still owns her property, and my mom, we have 30 acres between us, and last year leased it to a cannabis grower. So just that's an interesting aside. But and then my other grandpa was named James Aldred, and he was a rancher in Avondale, so even further east, closer to Rocky Ford. At that point.
Are you within that community, cultural community, Southern Colorado and northern part of New Mexico that I guess is Espanol or Nuevo Mexicanos?
Yeah, so that's an interesting, yeah, we can trace on my dad's, on my dad's side, we can trace back to northern New Mexico, early southern Colorado, before they became states or before they were even the United States territory.
Yeah, even so, we've seen with that where the history of Arkansas Valley is really the history of southern Colorado. We see that cultural influence coming to as far within the Arkansas Valley. Now, as far as to Southeast Colorado and Granada, that's, what's interesting is, for example, I know that they were able to get La Cucaracha all the way out to Rocky Ford, as far as like Juan Espinosa and others in the late 70s, 80s, 76 to 83. But as far as that kind of, during the Chicano movement and other respective, the La Cucaracha trying to push out information, still concerned about overall rights, Mexican Americans, is kind of interesting as far as social, but there's a lot of other things that, I don't know, since last time I may have spoken with you, we found out about what was the migrant housing there. I did talk to the policeman. I can't remember his name. The other one, there were two of them. I know one of them I talked to, he's still a trooper. He has just a scant amount of memory of what happened, and he thinks they went back towards the housing. They took that turn onto Highway 22.5 and headed back to where they were staying. But is the housing where it was in between the city and the Amache, right? That's where you went kind of
right
behind the town a little bit. Yeah, he thought and I can see how the disparity is within each who even was there on site. So anybody else before I'm not sure how else to. Anna, did you figure out where the accident was?
Kind of. I don't know. I'm looking at the map. I haven't quite determined where it is.
All right. This is one of the things about doing this class is where the accident was, the railroad crossing was in this Cone Ranch area where Martina was born. Before that, Cone Ranch, it was one of the sugar beet labor colonies, and I think it was also the office for the sugar beet company. So not only did they have the office there, but also they put in the labor colony. It's in the most literal sense, and I think the class now understands. Well, me too. So the sugar beet companies at the turn of the 20th century, they literally recruited Mexican nationals going, well, I don't know, they went other places like California and other places. Mexican nationals, Mexico, the Texas borderlands, and probably some other places in other than California. So they would actively recruit and transport them to Colorado and Arkansas Valley, the sugar beet companies. And there was actually one who worked, the labor director. And they would provide them either materials for building their houses, or they would just go ahead, and there were adobe buildings. And that's what Cone Ranch was. Cone 19, yeah, so yeah, it was initially, that's Melissa, Melissa, that's where we had interviewed a couple people already, but what's her name? Martina Pena was born there in 1931. She's still alive and she's 88 in Granada. So that accident site is where Cone Ranch was, and that's where the Japanese also were, the blacksmith shop, and I believe just where they kind of just centralized and went out to the fields in that area. Because it stopped the migrant housing there and then switched over during World War II. So the accident site is right there where historical events have gone on as far as shared space, believe it or not. I didn't really realize that until a month ago or so, really until we heard Martina Pena's. I'm really like, oh my goodness. And nobody knows this. So there are memorial crosses out there at each spot where they unfortunately flew out of the vehicle, and they're still there. And it's just nobody understands that connection now because of the separation of histories and not being brought together within public memory. So really, because there's barely any collective memory, because they moved around quite a bit. But even within this concept of those that the tragedy brings out somewhat a sympathy and Ramon Solis, but also the community feeling a sense of loss at the time. I think their only way of coping with that is to let it kind of be forgotten in some respects. And other than those memorials, it's interesting. Why would they come up here when, like, Melissa had a high school diploma and she did have a job down there? Why would she want to stop what she's doing down there in, I think, Donna, Texas, right there in Harlingen, right there on the very southern border there? Why would she come up here to work doing something she's never done before? Did she have a hearing aid? Was she taken care of in Texas or not? Or they were in Montana first, I think, for a couple of weeks, and then came down to Montana. So why would she come up here when what would be her social and personal environment happening as far as why she would do that? I don't know if anybody else has a comment on that, because y'all looked into this, so this is a question shot out to you guys too.
You have to kind of wonder, like, what they were promised as far as pay for the work with the onions, and then it seems like it didn't pan out the way they thought it would. Not only just because they don't know what they're doing with the work, but also that the pay rate wasn't quite what they were told. Maybe that it was not a daily or hourly wage; it's actually a piecemeal, which is a very different rate.
Yeah. So I named a oral history project, and that's what interviews I've done, and I tied the oral history project into the class here since I've done an oral history interview with Martina Pena, and also Antonio Escobel, who was, as he was growing up, family of migrant workers, stayed for some time in Grenada and Bristol and West Camp, Roosevelt School. in between Lamar and Grenada, and he'd been a teacher educator in Denver for quite a long time now. It really is a sense of, is it family staying together? I think Anna may have worked at the store or something, unless, yeah, unless, but so minimum wage. And so maybe she saw this making more money doing this up here, planting onions. You said like $15 an hour?
Yeah, one of my stories said some of the best. Now, again, this goes back to your point, Anna, when you hear some, $15 an hour,
Right.
that could have been awesome, but you're probably talking about a small minority of the people who can work that fast, have that skill, and are that strong to make that money.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting too, Michael, because I really remember I did not have time the day that I was reporting, but I drove out as far as I could to look at Amachi, and then there was a gate. At the time, there was a gate, and I thought, they must have a museum. There must be something, and it was literally a gate with a lock, and you could go to the town hall and ask them for the key. And so I think that's really true, that you're dealing with. I think a lot of people just wanted to forget, wanted to pretend like Amachi never happened in the area, right? And then B, the people who were there, most of them, I'm assuming, right, Michael, the vast majority of them returned to where they were from.
Oh, the Japanese Americans?
The Japanese, yeah.
That's probably one of the biggest injustices, other than being incarcerated, was they weren't able to go back to LA or the West Coast because their land was gone, their buildings were gone, or taken over by whoever was there. The racism, discrimination still continued. But
they did not stay, right? Most of them did not stay.
No, not. I think there was some that. Well, that's the biggest thing. I think that's one of the reasons why I tried to make sure. Well, this is a history class, because there was, there is, the original Japanese immigration in 1890 to the valley, so a few hundred, and Colorado, but there were a few hundred there, and there's a couple of families still there, and descendants, like Rocky Ford, for example. And because of Amache, that aspect of history in Colorado has been overshadowed, and there's nothing that's brought in to to help out with, say, hey, this is there might have been went to Amache from the valley. Whether or not they went back out to, I don't know. Or that's the biggest issue. There's no oral history there. Would help that out. And I believe because Martina was at the train depot, she's 12 years old. The Japanese Americans families came off the passenger cars. Literally, I think this would, I won't say corralled. I mean, that's almost, I don't want to say that. We can see what happened during the Holocaust, and that's a totally different, that's, concentration camps, death camps for the Jews and the Holocaust. But they were put in the back of army trucks. She remembers that, and there is that picture of the young girl right there on the very edge, the Japanese girl. I think it might have, I don't know if it was one of the, I don't think it was Dorothy Lyon, very similar, just one of the hired federal government photographers like Dorothy Lyon that took that picture as she was getting off and faced of the century, but yeah, she remembers that, and she has shared memory of the probably the farmers, the Japanese, coming in before that, World War II. So it's a shared history, and she was able to reflect upon the time and place for the Japanese American survivors. I would, what time do we got? Yeah, So really the students have, they got last week their final and they're coming up to have them doing their final is their final statement on justifying oral history project or not. And I think one or two are probably going to go with, I call it either statement of need for that, or because also with the national park is looking at Amache, but very specific to the built up area on the boundary of the National Historic Landmark. Where the housing is, that's where the hospital was. They can't look at that, mandated by Congress. They look only at within. Is So they can either do a statement of protest, they just call for action because they see some injustices within maybe possible human rights violations. And with hemp presenting new but old challenges at the same time within that, and social support, social needs needed, whatever level for migrant workers. And that's what I have them doing. You feel you can go ahead and chime in if you'd like to share where you're at with that for a moment if you'd like. Then we can finish with that. There's just,
Yeah, I'm probably gonna do something, statement of need on speeding up the process for Awashi to become a national park. I think there's plenty of information out there for it to be justified. It's just being delayed. So with COVID, they're delaying it even longer.
and then there's good some reflection, or there's good insight because of the current health outbreak. And the challenge is already, I think it was either, well, shoot, it's Morgan or Justine. Well, even with Anna, you brought in DACA also in this consideration. Trevor is hit upon directly within possible, or Adon, wherever he's at, maybe he's dropped out again. Adon also really strict within agriculture on the very specifics of hemp growing. Some possible solutions, but also connecting to its social and really cultural challenges. So it's kind of a both ways where the cultural part is able to overcome those challenges within social environment, social political, the discrimination. They both described the discrimination, segregation in the movie theater in Lamar, the restaurants, both of them, firsthand experience with that. Lamar was very segregated with Mexican Americans. And unfortunately, we've very seen with both of them very recent actual overt in some respects of that, as far as when you guys remember what Antonio went back in 2010 with another family member, and I find it very hard to put in my imagination. He went back in 2010, Grenada and Lamar, and he said, you guys remember, he said that somebody else came by him while they were in the car and said, go back to Mexico. And this is 2010. And I can't, it's hard. No, it's impossible for me to even imagine how in 2010 that's even possible. Oh, that doesn't make any sense to me. I can't even have a hard time coping with that. It's just not impossible. I can't. That's more of a personal kind of connection, but it's just as far as a teacher and trying to, let's just put it in a scenario and put it in our heads as, put ourselves in the shoes. But I can't do it. It's impossible. Just concerns with Manzanola. Actually, there's still actual Otero County housing associations, migrant housing, centralized. They had issues in 2016, and they had to come in and negotiate. Teresa Trujillo, along with former state senator Angela Giron, to negotiate between the housing authority and the migrant families there. They were staying out overnight waiting for the application to be approved. There was still plastic on the mattresses. There was no representative there at the times when those families would be able to get there early in the morning or late evening. It was really very similar things that was going on at the time of the late 60s and early 70s with the same concerns all over the state of Colorado and at the time migrant housing. Just this lack of consideration really related to that attitude, that racial attitude.
And I think agriculture is an interesting industry, right? Because we can make technological advances, but at its core, it's still very much a labor-intensive industry, right? And even with hemp and cannabis, still quite labor-intensive.
Yeah.
And so and with the way that our subsidies work and our society in general, the need and the sort of expectation of cheap food continues. And so that puts the workers in a really tough spot, right? Because the expectation is we still need extremely cheap and plentiful labor for that, right? And so that's where discrimination comes in. That's where poor conditions come in. That's where recruiting into other areas to try to get people to come who may not necessarily know what's going on here. So I think you guys are doing super interesting work, really, I do. And as someone who grew up in that area, I'm eager to read what you guys wrote, because that's I think it's issues that are only growing, right?
Yeah, that's I think there are a lot of when I talk about cultural, I think that's where my focus was within the project, and then the questions, and what I was talking to Martina, and she talks about how she makes traditional from scratch tamales and teaching her daughter Regina, and how she's able with just that production of cultural is where with very just basic personal level, individual level, can overcome she did describe herself as far as that discrimination. It really is becoming where just the life that is led in the human condition tends to, in the family. So that's why I call it, Amache La Familia. Connection to Amache Ochini Prowers is surprising within the class. And we talked about Bogsville over there next to Los Animas. And really it was Mache herself, and along with Thomas Boggs' wife, Nuevo Mexicanos, was the ones that dug this ditch. But their historic site and the people there, Otero County Historical Society of Bogsville, just talk about the cattle industry. The guys themselves, but it really, they dug a tar box ditch. It had agriculture there. So they were talking about the 1860s. So it was Ronaldo that brought over that part that I argue with, that it was the Seculas. Yeah, that part that was prominent within that community, of distinct from just, the Spanish Empire and Mexico. It was that. It wasn't Thomas Boggs who knew how to dig a ditch. No, it's that culture in the San Luis Valley, for example, northern part of New Mexico, is Sequoias. Distinct your descendants, distinct active cultural group. Even I don't know how far we go with different dialect there. That's what I've been told. And then we see George Otterby and his ancestor, Charles Otterby's. And I think everybody somewhat has understanding that maybe there's something here other than that would help bring out their stories, even within the migrant workers, but in Japanese American. It's been. Anybody else got any concerns, questions? I don't want to extend out any further. Usually I have to be quiet and, Zoom conference, this is really hard. They tend to, okay. I would definitely appreciate that if we can leave this for them on YouTube, Melissa. Are you okay with that?
Yeah,
I think
sure.
I shouldn't have asked you after the fact, and I apologize for that. Okay. Yeah, so for them at least, and I really appreciate it very much. I think that they only got 1 week left, so hopefully this gives them a little bit more perspective. I don't know who it was. It might have been somebody down in Texas, I think, did talk to one of the aunt and uncle, Melissa. Yeah, Melissa's family, aunt and uncle. There's a picture of them out front of their house a week ago or so after the accident. I can't remember who it was. I don't know if I put it on with their sources on Zotero or not. Does anybody?
Yeah, I think you did.
Okay. Well, it was okay. So there was a picture of her aunt and uncle, and if I was able to talk to them oral history and for the project, that's how far I want to go, and maybe even try to find Christopher. I think I did. He's down there still in Donna, Texas, but he's I think the accident traumatized him. He's gotten in trouble quite a bit already since then. I think he's like, I don't know, in mid-20s or so, or
Well, he'd be about 30 right now.
yeah,
Yeah,
30,
he'd be
yeah,
about
yeah.
30.
So he's had a checkered past legally. Unfortunately, I would, and I think some Ramon Solis's family is probably here in Colorado Springs. Possibly his 2 sons. Rocky Mountaineers did take a couple pictures of them after the accident. I think it was, yeah, because it got in the Denver Public Library photos. You mentioned Joey's girlfriend, their family. Okay. I don't want to maintain any more awkward silence. I don't know if I got any more questions. I think your time has been valuable. I don't want to waste any more of your time. Melissa, if nobody else got any questions or comments, I would definitely go ahead and finish this out. And I'm very grateful that took the opportunity to speak with us today. I really am very appreciative.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and like I said, I'm really interested in all of the history and guy there.
Yeah.
And I think you guys are doing really interesting work. I obviously am very biased because this is where my family and where I'm from, but I think there's a lot of interesting hidden and lost and needing to be found cultural and historical facts about Southern Colorado. I think it's a really, especially Pueblo and the San Luis Valley, and it's a weird place. So I appreciate all the work you guys are doing.
Thank you, Melissa. You can go ahead and disconnect. Accept the class. No, please, class, stand by. Melissa, thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Please, rest of y'all, just stand by for a couple minutes. So I wanted to just real quick talk about for next week. I think we only got one real class Tuesday, right? What's the day? This is it, right? Okay, so we have a final. I graded. I should have finished up all your papers. He didn't get a grade yet on them hemp analysis. Everybody good? Got it? Okay. All right. Not bad. Not bad at all. Actually, impressed, and you all in the right directions towards doing up your final. If the time between now and then, as far as your final seems kind of rushed or squeezed, as far as the next week or so, um, well, just think of your hemp analysis as just that continuation. Some of you kind of already made it as your template, I could tell, but what I want to take a couple minutes is to go ahead and let you know, so what is statement of need as opposed to this hemp analysis? All right, for those who you take what it is you find, you make that decision. As far as there's a demonstrated need, you think we're good to go, that's the oral history project, or that national significance for Omache. Okay, unless you believe you want to go further and say the heck with it, or a little bit of both. As far as your statement of protest and call for action, in regards to that, I'll just reiterate. Uh, so take a look at your hemp analysis, put it all together, put it right there in front of you, along with the criteria for your either the statement of need or statement of protest. Okay, consider what it is that you brought together with your hemp analysis. I can't really recommend that you can try, except for maybe who was it that tried to make a lot of calls to the farmer agribusinesses? Was that you,
Well,
Morgan?
I think Aiden did.
Aiden?
Yeah. I
Okay.
He's still on here.
If you, yeah, Morgan.
I did make some calls and it just went
Okay.
nowhere.
Yeah,
Make
I
that
did too.
your
They
evidence.
just didn't go anywhere.
Make that your evidence. Make that your figuring out what you want to do with that. That is your evidence. Who you call, put in a chart, put in a nice little spreadsheet, however you want it. The questions, usually you can put the list of how many questions you have. You put it in there. It's really, okay, so make that part of, like, appendix or something like that. Those list of questions. You commenced with your own research project there. That's really good. For those that kind of already gathered what they needed to gather for the hemp analysis, don't go too much further trying to gain new evidence, even though you haven't been able to get a hold of somebody or not, because that's the rabbit hole that I've been here in a million times, which I'm actually in right now with the project. Don't do that. Focus on the final. So whether or not statement need is a statement need, demonstrated need, gap in history, gap in the voice to be brought out for Mexican Americans and migrant workers. If you do statement of need, those primary sources are dealt with carefully and analyzed in such a way as to define what you would picture your oral history project justification. So the list I gave you guys, all right, this list is not all inclusive, and nor do you have to hit upon every single aspect. All right, I think that defining a demonstrated need for the project is there. You've already done the hemp analysis and already your initial midterm. Okay. It's kind of redundant when I go down there and say define demonstrated need. No, go ahead and do that. That's the two main things. Define, state the demonstrated need for the project, and define the demonstrated need. And as far as historical background and historical significance, it's important to, some of you kind of skip through, again, you kind of looking at me as your audience. And that's when you skipped, take what you want from the historical background, the sugar beet industry, or even earlier with anything culturally that we saw through the 19th century. I saw some of you already compare to the sugar beet industry. All right, that was something that we see that historical connection of continued problems. Okay, but be a little bit more storytelling in regards to that. What are your goals? Okay, now is the time to go to where your goals are and present that within the introduction. Don't come to the conclusion and say, um, that conclusion may seem to the reader, which I've seen, that should have been at least introduced. Okay. Um, so really that's what the work plan, some of you, I don't know, who is it, Trevor? Give me a good work plan as far as your conservation thing. Um, take one of the aspects of historic significance is sustainability. That one time you said it, that was a really clever way to put it in there. Take it, put conservation in there, water conservation, um, something like that. Don't repeat yourself too much, and keep it fresh for your audience. Uh, Let them surprise them at the end that you mentioned sustainability at the beginning, but here on the end, I'm going to connect to that actual criteria within the national park looking into sustainability for if it was to become a national park. So keep it fresh, keep the middle part where it's like water conservation, center pivots, I don't know, whatever else you got there within your water wells and that connection personally with your family, I think it was, or in such a way. Or a statement of protest. I'm not trying to be long-winded. I think I'm already done here. You made a determination for immediate need, call for action, take initial steps to impact public governmental policy. So that your audience is very important still with this. And please, 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 please put somebody in your mind there who you want to write to. Not me. Take me out of the picture now. Take me completely out. I'm only here to see if you clearly articulated one of these approaches. Please, it's not me, guys. I've already brought 3 people in that you see. And the other part is you're bringing out those voices. You're bringing out Christopher Cruz's family in the accident. I didn't want to bring this at the beginning. I could have. I thought about, let's just right at week 3 or so, talk about this accident. But I didn't want to. It was a really kind of a tough call because I didn't want to, just still maintain some level of objectivity and look at the historical background. So yes, it was kind of my way of molding this way that I want you guys to look at it. But those are the ones you want to bring the voices out. If you need to be able to articulate that as best you can, because if you continue to not bring forth what it is the minimum within your writing and your grammar, it's going to undermine that. Okay, so you bring their names out, you talk to some about your family, whoever you got, then do so, but do it clearly, and do not stop at your first draft or second. Even at the point to where you guys still continue with capitalizing regular nouns and pronoun. I think it's starting to minimize, but you gotta go in there. All right, they're not it. Okay, Mexican Americans are not it. That's probably kind of a cruel way of looking to stop you guys from using this indirect pronouns, but now is the time. So you got Melissa, you have Melissa Resendez, you got Cristela Rios. They're real people. If you see their pictures in that one article, look at them, look at who it was, know their names. Okay, they're reflecting upon whether you see where the problem is. They weren't taken care of. There was already established process of support there in 2006. And now with temp, it's like they're ignoring this, like going back to 1960s or even Bracero program. Well, that's bull crap. Okay, I'm sorry. No, okay, I'm going on a tangent. All right, I didn't want to get too into it, but I hope this kind of gives you a more individual connection with the accident right here before your final. But now you got a knowledge of the historical background, and go with that. Thursday, well, Tuesday, we'll go ahead and come in and we'll see where you guys are at with your questions, your concerns, and your outline needs to be bring in all that what you got. Do not disavow what you've already written. That's with your midterm and discussion responses. Okay. Any questions? As far as the final, we get back, and I was a little bit behind on getting the link up for the hemp analysis, but the final will be such way. I'll let you know Tuesday exactly how that's going to work on Thursday. It is due on the 30th, pretty much around class time. So I'll let you go for now if you don't have any questions.
Have a good day.
Yeah.